Hi guys, welcome back. We are covering lesson 3 over Kansas getting involved in the US Civil War from 1861 to 1865. And before we get into that, I mentioned with lesson 2 we talked about the Pony Express just a smidge. And I mentioned that Mr. Allen and I have visited the Hollenberg Pony Express station. I'll show you really quick some of the pictures from that. Here's and remember this is all pretty much original. They've done a little bit of repair work to it, but it's pretty much original how it would have been back in the 1800s. And this was one of the Pony Express stops, one of 200 stops between uh, pretty much Kansas City, Missouri, all the way to California. And there's the historical marker that was nearby, and a really cool sign pointing to it. Okay, this is the inside of the Pony Express station. And remember, this was a place where they would just pass the letter on to the next rider. And this is where they would rest, get supplies that they needed, get food, get a meal, and just rest for a little bit before they had to go on their way again. But it was really kind of a neat place to visit. It was just kind of out in the middle of nowhere up in northern Kansas, near Hollenberg, Kansas. Oops, went too far. That's visiting Amelia Earhart's home. But, all right. Just wanted to share those with you. Now back to the Civil War. Civil War began right after Kansas became a state, and pretty much things that happened in Kansas territory is what led up to the Civil War beginning, or helped lead up to it. But slavery was a big part of that, and the rights of states to govern themselves. The Confederacy, the southern states, they wanted to preserve their way of life. They wanted to keep slavery, which their livelihood depended on slavery, so they wanted to keep it. So when President Lincoln was elected in November of 1860, the South was afraid that he would totally outlaw slavery. No more slavery in the whole United States, and the South didn't want to have that. So after the election, South Carolina voted to secede, which means they were choosing to break away from the U.S. Now, by the time Lincoln's inauguration in March of 1861 happened, 6 more states had seceded to form the Confederacy, the Confederate States of America. So that big time tipped the balance in Congress to the anti-slavery majority. In April 1861, Confederate troops fired on Fort Sumter, which was in South Carolina, because the Union troops wouldn't leave the fort. It was in the South, and the South didn't think the Union should be there anymore. So the Civil War started with that. James Lane, we've talked about him a little bit as well. He was that senator from Illinois who eventually changed his mind about slavery when he came to Kansas. He was a state senator for us, and he represented Kansas in Washington, D.C. And Washington, D.C. during the Civil War was very vulnerable because it was located between Maryland, which was part of the North, or kind of a border state, kind of on the fence because people were pro-slavery and anti-slavery there, and Virginia, which was a southern state, a strong southern state. A lot of people were worried that the Confederate forces would take over Washington, D.C., take over our nation's capital, and that would not be good for the North. So James Lane, he came to Washington, D.C. to serve as our first U.S. Senator for Kansas, and he was one who is known for making abolitionist speeches on the street. Remember, abolitionists are people who are strongly against slavery. After his speech, he organized over 100 different Kansas men into what was called the Frontier Guard to provide special protection for the president, because at that time, the army hadn't reached Washington, D.C., and they were concerned that the president and our capital was not safe. So the guard camped out, the Frontier Guard camped out in the White House, like actually in the White House, for 3 weeks until the Union troops could get there. So a bunch of Kansas guys protected President Lincoln and our nation's capital at the start of the Civil War. Have a neat little thing there. All right, so Kansans volunteered to fight for the Union in the Civil War, and we'd just become a state. We were wanting to show our support. We were grateful that they had admitted Kansas as a state, so we wanted to support the country that we were newly a part of. At the start of the war, we had approximately 30,000 men between the ages of 18 and 45 in the war. More than 20,000 volunteered to fight in Kansas regiments. Nearly 8,500 Kansans did die in the war, though, however. African American soldiers, there weren't a lot of African Americans who could serve in the Union Army at the start of the war. As the war continued, the Union needed more volunteers to replace men who were dying in battle. So any soldier they could get was better than none. In 1862, Kansas became the first state to enlist African Americans as soldiers. And of course, Senator James Lane was behind that. He formed the first Kansas Colored Infantry. And in 1863, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, which was his famous speech that declared all enslaved people in the rebelling states to be free. So if you lived in the South and you were a slave, according to the Emancipation Proclamation, you were free. And emancipate just means to free from someone else's control. After this, the Union allowed blacks to serve in the military. Many felt that they were fighting for the freedom of their fellow man, and that it was a great way to gain equality for free blacks. Nearly 185,000 African Americans fought in the war for the Union, and about 38,000 of them did die in battle. So they were fighting for others' freedom and were willing to give their lives for them to get that. Women really didn't fight in the war, but they did have a role. They did make important contributions to war efforts. They actually organized relief efforts, making uniforms and blankets for soldiers to use in battle. They also raised money for supplies, and they worked as nurses on the battlefield, helping take care of the injured men. Women also took over work for the men who had gone to war, like they were working on farms, helping bring in the crops since their husbands were off at war, or running businesses since their husbands were not there. They also often set up camps or hospitals in their homes to help service the soldiers. So they did their part. Believe it or not, the Civil War, which was mostly fought on the eastern side of the United States, eventually did make it to Kansas. Because, tensions between Kansas and Missouri were still really high. Missouri didn't secede from the Union. They were still technically part of the United States and still technically fighting for the same side of the war as Kansas. However, Missouri still allowed slavery. Kansas did not. There were a lot of guerrilla soldiers, and this doesn't mean monkeys, soldiers, or anything like that. Guerrillas were members of small groups of soldiers who were not part of the army, like guys that would go rogue and just kind of do their own thing. So guerrilla soldiers from both sides would raid towns basically along the border. A very famous raid by a guerrilla soldier was Quantrill's raid on Lawrence. They always picked on Lawrence. Poor Lawrence. On August 21st, 1863, William C. Quantrill, a Confederate guerrilla, he was from the South, he and 400 men rode into Lawrence at dawn, and they attacked the town. Lawrence had been a anti-slavery town to begin with. Kansas was anti-slavery, but Lawrence still strongly anti-slavery, so that was the reason why they attacked it. But they fired at every man they saw on the streets, shot into windows of stores and houses. In the center of town, they even fired into the tents of these new army recruits, killing a lot of them. Quantrill and his men continued to terrorize the town, and their goal was to kill as many men and boys as they could. Because if they killed the men and boys, then they wouldn't be going off to fight in the war. So fewer people to fight for the Union. That was their thinking anyway. And kind of a funny little part here. Some of the men So they wouldn't be shot, they would be able to escape. They dressed as women. Yeah. 4 hours later, at least 140 men and boys were dead, with only one Confederate shot and killed. So they kind of surprise attacked them and did a lot of damage on Lawrence. Order number 11 was a big part of this. It forced all settlers in the four western Missouri counties to move. Basically, the Union Army wanted to prevent more raids across the border. They didn't want any more attacks like Quantrill's raid. And a year later, there would be a civil war battle that would be fought here. And that battle was the Battle of Mine Creek. In August of 1864, Confederate general for the South, Sterling Price, he led troops into Missouri, and he was trying to capture Missouri for the South. He was told to gather new recruits and gather as many supplies as he could. He traveled toward Kansas City, but he was turned away by Union soldiers, so he started heading south along the Kansas-Missouri border, where all the issues have been. Price and his men crossed into Kansas, into Lynn County, and set up camp. Lynn County is just a couple counties north of Pittsburgh, just to give you guys an idea there, or a couple counties south from Kansas City. Along the way, Price and his men captured 500 wagons of supplies, so yay, score for them. But they weren't real bright because they refused to let go of the supplies to speed up their retreat. So here they are dragging along 500 wagons with supplies, trying to get away from the Union Army as fast as they can, but they have all these wagons of supplies slowing them down. And they don't want to leave any behind, and that which would help speed them up. So they're just continuing on. They don't want to turn loose of the supplies that they've stolen. Obviously, the Union Army was able to catch up with them fairly quickly, and there was a series of skirmishes. These are just minor unplanned battles that just happen. And at Mine Creek, which is near Pleasanton in Lynn County, 2,500 Union soldiers faced 7,000 Confederates, which the Union was very much outmanned there. But in less than an hour, the Union had won with its cavalry. Cavalry is just military fighting on horseback. Price and his remaining men retreated, trying to take as many of the wagons as he could. If General Price had been more concerned about his army and welfare instead of all the supplies, they probably would not have lost the Battle of Mine Creek. Just my opinion there. Eventually, the war came to an end. Mine Creek was the last major battle in the West, or west of the Mississippi. The Confederacy didn't have enough troops, and the Union was beginning to blockade the Confederate ports, making it difficult for the South to get supplies. So things were really tough on the South, and they ended up giving up. They surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse. Confederate General Robert E. Lee put in the surrender on April 9th, 1865. 5 days later, President Lincoln was assassinated or killed by surprise. He was shot at Ford's Theater. He was watching a play, and John Wilkes Booth assassinated him. He was a Southern sympathizer. That changed the country for quite a while. Some changes that were brought on by the war. On December 6th, 1865, even though the war was officially over, the 13th Amendment to the Constitution was ratified, and that made slavery illegal in the U.S., finally. 620,000 Americans had lost their lives in the war, and this made the Civil War the deadliest war in U.S. history, still to date. 50,000 civilians died in the war, too, just being in the wrong place at the wrong time. All of the death left the country grieving and just trying to figure things out from there. So we'll get into more settlement with chapter 5. And we'll just kind of leave it at that. Have a great day, guys.